My dad was the consummate businessman. He had one of those larger-than-life personalities where he could sell just about anything to anybody, and he managed his company in what I thought was an incredibly Christ-like way. He had a small to medium-sized company for most of its 25-year history that had somewhere between 150 and 250 employees at its most productive. My dad took the first hour of every morning, walked through their manufacturing plant, greeted every employee by name, spent the first hour or so of the day just getting in touch with the people he was managing and the people who worked for him. In fact, I remember very vividly sitting around the dinner table when I was in middle school, listening to my dad talk about his enthusiasm and his passion for this new company that he was going to start. I also vividly remember how he didn't ask us, but he informed my siblings and I how he was putting all of the money that he'd saved for college for us into this new business. Now, I wasn't particularly financially savvy when I was in middle school, but I knew enough to know that if the business failed, my siblings and I were completely on our own for college. Now, as it turned out, the business prospered incredibly and paid for our college many times over. And my mom and dad both came to a vibrant faith a little bit later in life. And we had many discussions about how he attempted to integrate his faith with what he did through most of the work week. Now, my folks were part of a very strong, very solid Bible teaching church for many, many years. But the only way that my dad ever made a connection between his faith on Sunday and his work life on Monday through Friday was in this way. As he had been taught through his church for many years, he said, churches collect revenue, they don't generate it. And so somebody needs to be out there generating revenue for, in his view, what the really important stuff in God's kingdom was about. And we talked many times about this. And that's the only way he ever made any kind of meaningful connection between his faith and his work. Now, the importance of this area, of getting this right on our theological understanding of our work and calling and vocation, really came home to me a few years ago. I was having a conversation over dinner with my youngest son, sort of a last dinner before he went off to college 3 time zones away. I wanted to give him a little booster shot for taking his faith seriously before he went off to college. And I remember as we sat around the dinner table and had this conversation, I started to ask him some questions about how he was planning on nurturing and maintaining his spiritual life once he got to college. And it became clear to me as we talked about this that he equated his spiritual growth and spiritual maturity only with what I would call church stuff. Now, as important as that is, it occurred to me as we talked about this further that nobody had ever really helped him make the connection between his faith and the thing that he was the most passionate about in his life, which was stage and theater and acting. He's a theater major in college. That's his dream and his passion. And as we talked a little bit further, we made reference to his best friend who was headed for a Christian college to be a Bible major, and his goal was to be a youth pastor in a local church. Now, remember, as we talked about this further, my son, he didn't say it directly, but I was left with this sort of nagging sense that my son felt like because of what his best friend was planning on doing for a living, that the bar was higher for him in terms of how seriously he was going to have to take his faith. In other words, I think my son recognized that because he wasn't going to get a paycheck from a church or some other Christian organization, that he was somehow getting a pass on having to take his faith quite as seriously as his best friend was, who was planning on being a youth pastor. And I recognized, wow, if that view of work and calling and vocation was somehow a license to not take your faith quite as seriously, that really underscored to me as a dad, as a parent, and if I were a pastor, if I were a youth pastor, knowing that my high school and college students might be thinking that they could somehow take their faith a little less seriously because of where their paycheck was coming from. That's the kind of stuff that would keep me up at night. Now, I think that underscores some of the reasons why getting this area right in terms of work and calling and vocation is so important. The Barna Research folks have done a lot of study on this in the last few years. What they have discovered is that when churches really address the area of a high school or college student's work and calling and vocation and address it thoroughly, they have found that the church's retention of those high school and college-age students increases by a factor of 3. Now, the other thing that got my attention on how important this area is was simply taking a pencil to this and doing the math. I thought about how much time does the average person spend in the workplace? My guess is if you work full-time, you spend somewhere between 40 and 60, maybe more hours than that in the workplace. Now contrast that with the number of hours that the average person spends in the church building. My guess is if you are among the most committed to your church, you probably spend between 5 to 10 hours a week in various things that involve your presence in the church building of the church where you are involved. I think if you're more normal, I think you probably spend between 3 to 5, maybe 6 hours a week in the building of the local church that you worship in. Now think about how that math works out. If you do the math on this and think about how much time the average person spends in the workplace, as opposed to how much time the average person spends in his or her local church. When I put the pencil to this, I recognize that the average person spends roughly 40 to 60 hours a week in the workplace. And the average person spends roughly somewhere between, I'd say, 3 to 6, 7, 8 hours in the church building on a weekly basis. That's a difference of a factor of 10 between the time the average person spends in the workplace and the time spent in the church building. And what follows from that, it seems to me, is that simply by virtue of the amount of time that's spent in the workplace, the workplace is the primary arena in which God molds, shapes, and forms us spiritually. Simply by virtue of the amount of time that we spend. Now, that's not to minimize what takes place inside the church building. That stuff is very important. But churches, in my view, are a combination of boot camps and mass units, where they're designed to equip us for our service to God out in the world. And I like to refer to them as mass units because they bind up the wounded and the brokenhearted as well. Now, if you're a pastor, think about the amount of time that the people you serve spend in the workplace as opposed to the amount of time they spend in your church building. Now, again, not to minimize how important it is for what goes on in the church building, but the primary arena, the primary crucible in which God is going to shape the men and women who you serve in your local church is probably going to be in the workplace. And it seems to me one of the primary tasks of pastors and church leaders is to help the men and women who we serve, have their antenna up so that they can be aware of the kinds of things that God is doing in the workplace to shape, mold, and form them spiritually. Now think about this in a little different way. The amount of time you spend in the workplace seems to me makes the workplace the primary arena in which you fulfill the mandate to love your neighbor as yourself. Now most of the time we don't think much about how we can fulfill the second greatest commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves with what we're doing in the workplace. Now, I think the other thing that makes a big difference here is that given the amount of time that we spend in the workplace, it is the primary arena in which you are able to use your spiritual gifts and the talents and gifts and skills that God has equipped you with. So these are some of the reasons that in our view, your work matters to God, why it's important, and why this area is so critical.